All right, welcome back. I hope everybody is doing wonderfully today. In Chapter 7, we will be discussing infectious agents and cancer. And I'm going to have this chapter split into two videos. In the first video, first half, I will give you just a little bit of background, and then I'm going to talk about examples of infectious agents that are linked to cancer. And then in the second half, second video, I'll focus more on mechanisms. So how is it that these infectious agents are causing cancer? Now, I should start this by saying that obviously cancer is not an infectious disease, but there are quite a few infectious diseases that can increase your risk of cancer. And so it's believed that about 15% of all cancers worldwide are caused by viruses, bacteria, or parasites, but the bulk coming from viral infections, about 11%. So, there's a lot of interest in this phenomenon because obviously if we could reduce, you know, infection by these particular agents, we could also dramatically reduce the number of cancer cases. Um, so medically speaking, there's a lot of interest in trying to understand, well, what are these infectious diseases? How do they cause cancer? And then how can we reduce exposure to these particular infectious agents? So if you've taken microbiology, you're probably familiar with Koch's postulates, but these were postulates designed to demonstrate that a particular infectious agent causes a specific disease. Um, and there's really four conditions that have to be met in order to satisfy Koch's postulates. The first is that whatever the suspected pathogen in has to be detected in diseased tissue, so in this case in cancerous tissue. Then you have to be able to isolate that particular pathogen, virus, bacteria, whatever the case may be, isolate it from the diseased host, grow it in the lab, and then when you reintroduce that lab-grown pathogen into a healthy, susceptible organism, you would have to see the same disease developing. So in this case, you would have to be able to show, or in the case of cancer, you'd have to be able to show this particular infectious agent that can cause cancer in a healthy organism. And then you have to be able to isolate that infectious agent again and show that it's identical to the original pathogen. And, if we're thinking of this in terms of human disease and human biology, obviously, you're not going to get a whole lot of volunteers for steps 3 and 4 here. So a lot of this would rely on animal studies. And, some of this has been shown for some of these infectious agents and cancer, I should say. Koch's postulates have been satisfied for many of these infectious agents. So as I mentioned, I want to go through some examples of different diseases that are linked to cancer, and mostly this is going to be viruses. So there's a relatively long list of viruses that have been shown to increase cancer risk, but I'll also touch briefly on bacteria and a couple of parasites as well. All right, so before we get into this, in case you haven't taken virology or don't remember some of the basic virology from micro, I want to talk about, well, what is a virus? And keep in mind that, right, viruses are acellular, so they, are not made of cells like bacteria would be, and in fact, they don't really even fit our definition of living organisms. They're not considered to be alive by a biological definition because you have to have at least one living cell in order to have life. So what are they? Well, they're very small infectious particles, basically cellular parasites, or parasites of cells, I should say. They consist of a genome, nucleic acid, DNA, RNA, single, double-stranded, can be pretty diverse depending on the particular virus. That nucleic acid is then covered and protected by a protein coat, and for some viruses you'll also have a membrane around that called the viral envelope, but that just depends virus to virus. So it's really a parasitic nucleic acid whose main goal is just to get inside a host cell and use the host cell machinery and components to replicate itself. And that is going to happen at the expense of the host cell. So you're using up host resources to carry out that replication. And in many cases, as the virus accumulates, we produce new virus particles inside the infected cell. Once they exit, they will do so by, in many cases, killing that cell, right? They may rupture and destroy the cell in that process. So that gives you some basic idea of a virus, right? Parasitic nucleic acid needs to get inside a host cell to replicate. So what are the viruses that have been linked to cancer? And as I mentioned, we're not going to get into mechanism here. I'm just going to kind of go through the list and give you a little bit of information on each of these viruses, but we'll dig a little bit more into mechanism in the second half of the chapter. So this whole idea that viruses could cause cancer really came about in the early 1900s thanks to the research of Peyton Rouse, which I'll go through here in a second, and we've already touched on in a previous chapter. But in general, people didn't think, cancer was caused by infectious agents because cancer itself doesn't really spread like an infectious disease, right? It's not like you come into contact with somebody with cancer and then, a week later, oh, no, I caught the cancer, right? It didn't work that way. But there was some experimental evidence with animals, and initially primarily with chickens for whatever reason, showing that some cancers could be transferred animal to animal. So Elleman and Bang were able to show that leukemia could be spread chicken to chicken through transfer of blood extracts. And then the very famous Nobel Prize winning experiments of Peyton Rouse showed that sarcomas, these solid tumors, could actually be spread chicken to chicken through filtered tumor extracts. And I know I went through this again, but just to remind you, so he was dealing with chickens that had this sarcoma, right, which is cancer of connective tissue, remember? And he would take the tumor out of the chicken, grind it up, filter it through a very, very fine filter with pores too small for cells to pass through. So we're basically eliminating any living cells, any cancer cells in that extract, and then inject that cell-free extract into a healthy chicken. And lo and behold, you get the same sarcoma developing at the site of that injection. This was 1911, and really the realization was, okay, the only thing that spreads this way that's smaller than a cell is a virus. So really the only logical explanation here was that we had to be passaging a virus from chicken to chicken, and that virus had to be causing cancer. And these viruses were called oncogenic viruses, are still called oncogenic viruses, cancer-causing viruses. And, there's now quite a long list of these. We have these grouped into DNA versus RNA viruses, depending on whether the viruses have a DNA or RNA genome. But we'll go through some of these that are more prominent in terms of their ability to cause cancer in humans. But just to give you an idea, since those first experiments in the early 1900s, we have grown that list substantially. And I also wanted to point out here that a lot of these oncogenic viruses can become latent, meaning they can essentially hide out or stay dormant in a host cell, in some cases for a very long period of time. And then due to some environmental stimulus, that may vary pretty widely depending on the virus, but due to some stimulus, they then can switch to a lytic infection, an active infection, where the virus is actively replicating and producing new viral particles. And it's typically going to be, you're going to need that kind of lytic infection in order for a virus to cause cancer. Usually the latent, hidden form is not going to be a cancer risk. So we fast forward 40, 50 years. by the late 1950s, there was a bunch of viruses that had been shown to cause cancer in animals, but still none that had been identified in humans. So there was some thinking, oh, okay, well, maybe there are no cancer-causing viruses in humans. But that all changed when Dr. Dennis Burkitt, who was running a medical clinic in Africa, he was seeing these unusual cases of lymphoma in children, but he was seeing these cases limited to a very specific geographic area, and it was basically the same areas where mosquitoes were very prevalent and malaria was a big problem. So that kind of caught his attention. These lymphomas, you can see, lymphomas are unusual. They're obviously cancers of lymphatic system, lymphatic cells, but they're almost somewhere in between solid and liquid tumors like you would find with a leukemia. So obviously you can get big tumors of lymph nodes, and you see this poor kid here with his some of the lymph nodes in his neck involved, and just these huge tumors and swellings. But basically Burkitt's idea was that mosquitoes then maybe were carrying some particular disease that was causing the cancer. I thought maybe it was something mosquito transmitted. And so in the 50s we had electron microscopy, and you really need an electron microscope to be able to visualize viruses. Michael Epstein, Yvonne Barr used electron microscope to show that they could find virus particles in these lymphoma tumor cells. It became called the Epstein-Barr virus. It's later shown to be a herpes family virus that primarily infects lymphocytes, not exclusively, but primarily. And so we had this evidence, okay, we've got this cancer, we've got this virus showing up in these cancer cells. So that seemed to suggest, yeah, Epstein-Barr virus may be linked to this lymphoma, right? Animal studies seem to support that. But the confusing part in terms of human disease is that it was shown that Epstein-Barr virus is very, very widespread. So it's estimated the vast majority, more than 90% of the world's population, has been infected with Epstein-Barr virus, and because it's a herpes virus, once you're infected, you're going to retain that virus for the rest of your life. But we were only seeing this lymphoma in these very specific geographic regions, as I mentioned, right, where mosquitoes and malaria were an issue. So what's going on, right? If this virus really causes cancer, why doesn't 90% of the world's population have lymphoma? And it's believed that we're only getting lymphoma in these kids where their immune system has already been suppressed due to a malaria infection, right, which is what's being transmitted by the mosquitoes. So that would explain this this specific distribution. And we'll get into this in the second half, but this is pretty common. And this will pop up when we talk about HIV as well, that immune suppression can greatly increase your risk of developing some of these virus-induced cancers. And as soon as AIDS came on the scene in the 1980s, we were seeing something very similar, where people whose immune systems were suppressed were developing some of these rare virus-induced cancers. So Epstein-Barr virus has been linked to Hodgkin's lymphoma, but this is the virus that causes mono, so that's a pretty common disease, right? A lot of teenagers will get mono. And like I said, once you've been infected with Epstein-Barr virus, which most people have, you're going to carry that virus for the rest of your life. If you have had mono, there is a slightly elevated risk for lymphoma, but nothing to lose sleep over. And not to get too deep into mechanism here, but it has been shown that Epstein-Barr virus induces proliferation of its host cells, and we think that may be this very rapid proliferation of infected cells may be linked to some of the cancer-causing ability. Um, and it's been shown that Epstein-Barr virus can cause proliferation of epithelial cells as well, not just lymphocytes. So there's like some nasopharyngeal carcinomas, nose and throat cancers basically, that are relatively common in Southeast Asia that have been linked to Epstein-Barr virus infection. We do see Epstein-Barr virus DNA sequences in some stomach, some breast cancer cells, but that link is not entirely clear. And there's some evidence that Epstein-Barr virus may not be causing all of these cancers, but it might just be helping them spread and encouraging their development. So, for example, one of the proteins encoded by the Epstein-Barr virus can bind to and inhibit a normal cellular protein that would normally shut down cell migration. And of course, we talked about that's one of the hallmark of cancer cells, right, is their ability to migrate. So if you have a virus that's promoting cell migration, that may help encourage the development of cancer, even though the virus is not causing the cancer itself in all cell types. Okay, so we've got Epstein-Barr virus and lymphoma. Next one on the list is human papillomavirus, HPV, which of course has famously been linked to cervical cancer in women. But as we'll talk about, it also is responsible for a number of cancers in men as well. But this link between, HPV is a sexually transmitted disease. This link between sexual activity and cervical cancer was known for quite a long time. So even in the 1800s, epidemiologists saw that populations that were not having sex, so for example nuns, were also not developing cervical cancer. So that was suggesting, that something about sex or a disease transmitted during sex may be responsible in large part for development of cervical cancer. We now know that to be primarily HPV. Interestingly, HPV is a big family of viruses. So there have been over 100 different HPV strains identified. But there's really two main strains that are responsible for the majority of cervical cancer cases. There's HPV-16, which you see in about half of all cases, and HPV-18 is the other big one. About half of all women get infected with HPV, but we really only see a pretty small percentage that have these persistent high-risk infections. And so some of that comes down to what strain were you infected with. Some of it may come down to other risk factors, like, for example, smoking. Interestingly, actually increases your risk for a persistent HPV infection. So another cancer whammy from cigarette usage. So this little pie chart is showing the prevalence of some of the different strains of HPV in cervical cancers. And as we said, HPV-16 accounts for the main bulk of cases, big count, big slice of the pie due to HPV-18. I do want you to know those two. HPV-45, a little less yet, and then you have a bunch of others that are responsible for much smaller numbers of cervical cancer cases. So primarily 16 and 18 are the two big ones to worry about. And as you may be aware, there are HPV vaccines now that protect against 16 and 18. I think the newer iterations even protect against some of these less common strains as well. So the first HPV vaccine was Gardasil. And when this first came out, you'd think, wow, if HPV is causing so many cases of cancer in women, everyone would want to get their kids vaccinated. But we're seeing very low compliance initially, even though the CDC was at first recommending this for 9 to 14-year-olds, right? Trying to get them vaccinated before they would become sexually active. And so there was a couple of issues that I think may have tied in with this low vaccination rate. One is it was relatively expensive, so initially not covered by insurance. It used to be a 3-shot regimen, so that's a little inconvenient. You got to go back 3 times pay for 3 different shots. Some of the newer ones only require a single booster, so 2 shots. And there was also some lack of awareness, right? A lot of people weren't familiar with the link between HPV and cervical cancer. And there was also a little bit of unease because HPV was a sexually transmitted disease. If you're a parent, I guess, at least for some parents, there may have been this feeling that, oh, okay, if I tell my daughter, yeah, we're giving you this vaccine for this sexually transmitted infection, that somehow that's like giving them permission to become sexually active. And or maybe some parents just don't want to think about the possibility of their kids becoming sexually active, maybe in a little bit in denial there. But at any rate, I think vaccination rates for HPV have increased, but I know there's still room for improvement there. And now they're actually recommending the HPV vaccine for both boys and girls. They've expanded that age range up into the early to mid 20s for both boys and girls. So if you haven't had your HPV vaccine yet, they would still recommend that you go get that, probably at your age. Next one on the list, hepatitis B, and we'll also talk about hep C. So, you may be familiar with hepatitis as just generically, disease characterized by inflammation of the liver, and you could get that through abuse of drugs or alcohol, or from infection with hepatitis viruses. Hep B is a DNA virus. It's very easily transmitted person to person in body fluids, and it's thought to be responsible for the vast majority of liver cancers. And HBV wasn't discovered until 1970. See a nice electron micrograph here of the HBV particles. So even though HBV is pretty easily spread, and there's lots and lots of cases worldwide every year, we really only see liver cancer developing in individuals that have had a long-term chronic infection. And you'll see this theme popping up over and over again when we talk about infections and cancer, that years of inflammation, chronic infection, is stimulating cell proliferation and increasing risk of cancer. So typically, the younger that you are, if you become infected with HBV, the greater your risk. And the longer that you're infected, the more chronic your infection, the higher your risk. So we don't hear a whole lot about HBV in the U.S. because infection rates are pretty low, but in parts of Africa, Asia, South America, it's a very big problem and contributes to a large number of liver cancer cases. And in fact, you'll see liver cancer rates are much higher in these parts of the world where hepatitis infections are more prominent. So hep C, unlike hep B, is an RNA virus, and this wasn't discovered until 1988. And it's a bloodborne virus, so you can only catch it in ways similar to HIV, really exposure to contaminated blood. So it's a lot more difficult to transmit than HBV. But interestingly, you see a larger proportion of people in the U.S. have hep C than hep B. And this is believed to be that because once you do catch hep C, you're much more likely to have a chronic long-term infection than you would be with hep B. So if you catch it, your body's more likely to retain it. And it's believed that about 5% of those with chronic hep C infections will eventually develop liver cancer. So even out of those with chronic infections, right, it's still a relatively low percentage that are going to develop cancer. All right, so we've got the hepatitis viruses. Next one, this one's a little rare, this HTLV1, which stands for human T-cell lymphotrophic virus 1. This is a retrovirus, which we'll get into a little bit more detail in the second half of the chapter, but it causes this rare and aggressive form of cancer called adult T-cell leukemia and or lymphoma, depending on the particular case. You don't tend to hear about this much in the U.S. because it's pretty rare, but it's a lot more common in Japan, Africa, and in parts of the Caribbean. It's a sexually transmitted disease, and again, although you may see 10% of individuals infected in some of these parts of the world, uh, a small percentage of those are actually going to develop cancer due to the viral infection. Next on the list, we have HIV, and I do want to say up front, right, HIV does not directly cause cancer, but because it's an immunosuppressive virus, right, destroys white blood cells and leaves people immunocompromised if they progress into AIDS. It will open them up to other virus-induced cancers. So probably the most common with HIV is this Kaposi sarcoma, which is a very rare skin cancer. You can see pictured here, but it was very common in AIDS patients. And so this Kaposi sarcoma is caused by a herpes virus called Kaposi sarcoma-associated herpes virus, which again, it's one of these examples where the virus can be quite widespread in the human population, but it's really only going to cause cancer if you're immunosuppressed, very similar to what we're seeing with Epstein-Barr virus and malaria. And so it's not just Kaposi sarcoma. We see AIDS patients susceptible to quite a few other virus-induced cancers as well. Typically, there is a pretty long delay between the initial infection and the induction of those cancers. And, this is one of the hallmarks of HIV infection is you have this very long, slow, steady, typically decline from just being HIV positive into immunosuppression and AIDS. And so what this indicates is that the immune system's ability to fight off these viruses is limiting the ability of these viruses to induce cancers in their human hosts. So again, HIV not causing cancer, but simply making you more susceptible to some of these other viruses that do cause cancer. So here we're looking at cancer rates in HIV, or really in AIDS patients, cancer types attributed to some specific different viruses. So for whatever reason, Kaposi sarcoma, almost 100%, more than 100% increased risk if you have HIV. We also see some HPV-induced cancers, cervical cancer, of course, but some others as well. And we see some attributed to HBV, HCV, right, liver cancers. So really, pretty much any of these virus-induced cancers. If you have AIDS, if you have HIV, you're at higher risk. Okay, so that's really the main list of viruses that are linked to cancer, and there is just really one key example of a bacteria that's linked to cancer, and that is H. pylori, which causes gastritis, inflammation of the stomach lining, and there's a very strong link between H. pylori infections and stomach cancer. So you can see the H. pylori bacterium. And one piece of evidence showing this link comes from the fact that stomach cancer is a lot less common in wealthy developed countries than in developing nations, and partly that is believed to be attributed to the widespread use of antibiotics in developed countries. So even though these antibiotics are not primarily being taken for H. pylori infections, they have the side effect of eliminating the possibility of H. pylori infection. So you don't tend to see H. pylori as a big issue in developed countries. There's also some evidence suggesting that diet may contribute to chronic H. pylori infections. And again, this is a case where it would be chronic long-term infection that would really be typically linked to cancer. And so I think this has changed, but traditionally, Japanese diet was very high in salt, like things like miso soup and very salty like pickled dishes. And there was historically a much higher incidence of stomach cancer in Japan than in other parts of the world. So diet may be a factor at play here as well. And then there's just a couple of examples of parasites that I wanted to show you that have been linked to specific types of cancer. And this is not accounting for a lot of cancer cases every year, thought to be less than 10,000, but still worth mentioning. So the first I wanted to bring up were these blood flukes, which are primarily only found in tropical parts of the world. So blood fluke larvae, which you can pick up by swimming or drinking from contaminated bodies of water. These larvae can actually penetrate the skin, and they will then mature in blood vessels in the intestine or in the bladder. And the presence of these flukes will cause chronic long-term inflammation called schistosomiasis, and this can very typically lead to bladder cancer or sometimes gallbladder cancers. And then the other I want to mention are liver flukes, which you primarily only find in Asia, but you could get these from eating undercooked or raw seafood, so sushi, anyone. But what these flukes do is they will lodge in bile ducts or some of the small ducts of the liver, and they'll cause these rare bile duct cancers, again, due to chronic long-term inflammation. So just to summarize some of these cancer-causing pathogens that we've talked about, and primarily I wanted to point you to the percent of global cancer cases that are thought to be attributed to these specific pathogens. So, H. pylori, I think over 30% of stomach cancers may be due to H. pylori infections. As I mentioned, these parasites are pretty rare and are accounting for a very small percentage of some of these, gallbladder, bladder, pancreatic cancers. And then in terms of the viruses that we discussed, really the biggest threats are the Hep B and C and liver cells, causing hepatocellular carcinoma, liver cancer, and HPV, as we discussed, linked to not only cervical cancer, but also, head and neck, some oral cancers in men, and things, nasty things like anal and penile vaginal cancers. So for sure, if we could reduce exposure to some of these infectious agents, we're going to reduce the number of cancer cases worldwide, and that would obviously be, a very desirable goal. So I'm going to stop there, and as I said in the second video, we will talk about mechanism and how some of these viruses cause cancer.